All right, here we go. New chapter. It's 4, and we're leaving probability behind for a while, starting to look at some statistics. We have 3 big goals for this first unit for 1. Yay, first stats. Number 1, understand what the role is for a statistician. And that is how you spell statistician. All right. Number 2, our second goal is how do we collect data? Third and finally is analyzing that data that has been collected. Okay, so analyzing how it's been collected. We'll actually analyze the data later on. Let's go back to our first goal here. The role of a statistician. First of all, a question needs to be answered. Sometimes you get this question from your boss. Sometimes you get it from a paper that you're writing and you need to gather information on it. Sometimes the client, because you're working for somebody and they ring you up and say, hey, I need this information. Can you gather that information for me? Second thing, how to collect the data. So every statistician has to make a decision on how they're going to gather that data. And then they have to analyze the data after it has been collected. Usually that involves computers. We aren't going to use that sophisticated techniques. You will in a higher education, but most of the time software, things like Excel, does quite a nice job of telling you what the data looks like. Then we need to form some sort of conclusion, and this is specifically in reference to the question that we asked at the very beginning. We come to an answer, so to speak. Yes? And finally, we have to explain the process of going through that data. Yeah? And we need to create some sort of report. In that report is usually something like, how confident are we of our conclusion that we got? So that is the role of the statistician. All right? Next, how do we collect the data? Well, there we have data from Star Trek, sorry about that. There are 4 ways, and I've highlighted them here. First of all, you can take a census or you can take a survey. A census is you ask everybody. So all the participants are asked about that particular question that you're after. In a survey, you only pick and we'll talk about more of this later, but a random sample. And there's a lot of different ways that random sample can be chosen, but you would only pick some of them because, number one, you don't have time or it's impossible to gather information from everyone that's out there. Then that data can be collected as an experimental study, experimental, versus an observational. Study. So an experiment is you do something to the sample that you are looking at. Yes, whether you take a sample of a particular bacteria and you want to see how it responds to a treatment. Yes, typically we see that a lot in science classes, but you can also give people like something to eat and say, ask them what flavors can they tell from that. Observational studies. These, you do nothing. The only thing you do is you watch, okay, and see how people react. So let's look at a couple of examples. Let's say you are registering for the CIHS 2021 school year. Yeah? What type of data collection is this? Number one, do we gather everybody or just some people? And we would have to say that with confidence, this is a census. Okay, we want everybody to register who is coming to the high school. So this is a census. Second of all, is it experimental or is it observational? This is an observational because we don't give them different registration guides and see how they do the process. We simply give them the guide and then they go through and do that. Okay? Second, let's look at another example here of studying a new playground equipment by setting up some sort of camera. That GIF is not working there. All right. There we go. All right. So we got the camera set up. Is this is it a census or a survey? Well, this is a survey because we aren't checking all the kids in the neighborhood, just the ones that come on that particular day. So it's a survey because we're just getting some data, some of the population. And in this case, it is observational too. We aren't necessarily treating observational the kids. Though, if you were to replace the equipment with something else, yes, then it, such as that you had the camera up, let's say prior to putting new equipment up, then you could say it is experimental because we're seeing what effect the new equipment has. All right, well, let's say you were sitting in a lunch line, much like these penguins, headed to get your food. And you give samples are given to the kids in the line. Number one, is it a survey or is it a census? Well, since we are giving it to the kids in lunch, and those are the kids that we are studying that are in line, not to the kids who are bringing their co-lunch, then we would have to say this is a census. Because we are looking at, obviously, we're not interested in the kids who either don't eat lunch or bring cold lunches. We're looking at kids who are interested in that lunch. Is it observational or is it experimental? This clearly is experimental because we are giving them samples and we want to see what their reaction is to those experimental lunch that we are handing out, little treats. Next, our third item that we want to talk about today is analyzing the data that's collected. So once we gather the data, then we want to verify, is it, number one, valid? Is it reliable? And third, is there any bias to the data? The first two are kind of tricky. They can be confused, validity and the reliability. So validity means that the data answers the question. If we're looking at that playground equipment, do more kids come to the playground to play, that type of thing. If we were looking at the lunch line, do the kids prefer this type or that type? Did we give them the right samples to do that? You wouldn't necessarily want to ask kids by showing them a picture of the playground equipment because they wouldn't know whether they like it or not. Second of all, is it reliable? This means can you repeat? Okay, so is it repeatable and get the same results? or I should say, not necessarily the same, but similar results, because you'll never get the exact same results. Sometimes the method that we're using is not reliable, and it doesn't give us consistent results, and that's problematic. Finally, the method that we're using to collect the data, does it skew the data for some reason? Like, let's say we only asked the kids in the lunch line on Fridays. Well, what about the kids that Monday through Thursday that were getting lunches? In our case, obviously, that would be no kids because we aren't attending school. All right? Now let's look at a few examples. The pilot's speedometer is 55 miles per hour over the real speed. Can she use it to verify her speed? Number one, is it valid? So we would have to say yes. Why? Because it's a speedometer and it's gathering the speed. So yes, it is the valid tool. Is it reliable? Our first inclination is to say no, and I would take no as the right answer here, because it is not giving us the accurate speed. Okay, so it's not accurate. Is there bias? Yes. It is always giving it as higher than normal. All right. All right. Example B. Let's say the policeman was using a breathalyzer to test if a driver was under the influence. That particular unit was too sensitive and always reads too high. Is it valid? Again, we would have to say yes, it is valid. Is it reliable? No, again, it is not reliable. Is there bias? Yes, again, it is higher than normal. So that's very similar to our last example there. All right, this last example, let's say we got a rusty scale and we're using to measure wrestlers before a contest. Sometimes it's over, sometimes it's under the particular weight of the particular wrestler. Is it valid? Yes, it is giving us a weight back. Is it reliable? No. Is there bias? In this case, there is no bias either, because sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. Okay? In our cases, you always want data methods that are valid. Okay? And you want them to be reliable. But we don't want any bias, so there shouldn't be any bias in our methodology. Okay? All right, well, good luck on your homework. The problems are listed in Schoology. Again, 3 main questions are going to be asking you. The role of the statistician. Number 2, how do you collect the data? And letter C, analyzing how the data is collected. Hopefully these